Okay, I thought what I would do in a few lectures is start to explain some of these readings. I know that many of you probably haven't read sort of scientific historical reports, and I just want to make sure that you're understanding the gist of what these articles are really about. So this week you're going to be reading Missing Plant Macro Remains as Indicators of Plant Exploitation in Pre-Dynastic Egypt. The author is given here, and of course here's the citation, the journal it's coming from, the date, and so on, and then the pages. So as we move into the article, now what you've seen is I've gone through, and this is what I usually do, is to highlight some important things that I want to remember. So if you recall from a few weeks ago where I had mentioned how you read a scientific article, or actually any article, is that I always read the abstract first, if there is one. Sometimes they don't have them, but if there is one, read it first because it gives you an overview of the article. And then read the introduction. And then when you're first looking, I then skip all the way down to the conclusion because that conclusion tells me pretty much everything that was in the article. And then what I end up doing is going back to the abstract and rereading everything this time in the entire article. So I just want to take you through this article and what it's about. So here you've got the abstract. It starts off talking about tubers, which are usually plant roots, leaves, and mericarps, which are parts of seeds. They can be whole seeds, but they're usually parts of seeds that are difficult to find because they're soft. So, you know, in ancient Egypt, you have lots of material that's made out of stone because that lasts, or metal, usually because that lasts. It depends on the environment. But you hardly get anything like soft tubers or plant remains unless, you know, it's a really good find. And as it says here, you know, there are more resilient things like cereal crops, seeds. So we're talking about wheat and barley and any type of grains that are most commonly found. And you go down here, and I've highlighted it here. So the present study discusses the results of analyzing the contents of a basket. Now, if you remember last week, I talked about this particular grave, or sorry, not last week, this week, I'm talking about this particular grave. And I'm getting lots of my information from this. So this is a pre-dynastic burial, and it's coming from HK, Hierakonpolis 43, Cemetery 43, in Upper Egypt, and here's the date, about 3600 BC. So this is a burial of a woman, and in it was a basket. So that's what the whole article is going to talk about. It says down below, and I've highlighted this, burial 33 is important because it's a woman. And based on the amount of materials found in her gravesite, she might have had some standing with her community. If you read through the article, it talks about she may have some standing, if not with her community, then certainly with her family. And if you go down to the bottom, they've looked at what is in this particular basket. And here you can see, you know, this evidence shows that the pre-dynastic inhabitants adopted a subsistence strategy based on cultivating cereals, emmer wheat, the gathering of wild fruits and tubers, as well as herding livestock. So what the article really is about the diet of these people based on what was found in this basket. And then what it goes through, it says, based on what they found, people are looking for food in wet swamp areas, as well as nearby desert habitats. And so what it's telling you is that people are herding, they're gathering food, wild food, and then they're farming in pre-dynastic Egypt. And then if you look at the introduction, so that just brings up all the information that you need to understand the article. So it's talking about climate in ancient Egypt. It's talking about how the type of materials they're talking about, tubers, leaves, and mericarps, are rarely found in these sites. That's why this article is important. And then you get a map. Now we've looked at where Hierakonpolis is before in the lectures. And then it talks about what this study is going to do. It's based on pre-dynastic archaeological site of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt. And then it talks a little bit about the cemetery and where it is. And then this study concerns the worker cemetery in cemetery number 43. And the excavations took place at this point. Now, then you can go through and read more of the introduction. There's about 470 human burials here. And they can date this material based on the grave goods. So remember, we talked about grave goods. It's whatever found in a grave other than the body. So mainly pottery. And we talked about seriation. Remember, seriation is when you find different types of pottery in burial sites, and that can tell you about the date. So the majority of the graves are dated to about 3,650 to 3,400 BC. And then you can go on and read that. And then here, of course, is the picture that I talked about in the lecture on this basket. And then they're going to point out the same thing they did in the abstract. It's burial 333. And then the article also shows a drawing of what was found. Now, if you go to the website, and I've given you that in Blackboard, you can actually see these real objects, not just the drawings. Then there's the material and methods. So you don't have to read through this particular part. It just tells about what they, where they found this particular burial and how they looked through everything. And then you've got the results. So anyway, if you remember, you should read through the introduction, or read through the abstract, read through the introduction, and then look at the conclusion. So that's what I'm going to do here. Here's a conclusion. So the evidence obtained in this study shows that people exploited wild plants in different ways. So they looked at edible fruits, or found edible fruits and tubers that were collected from the desert and swampy areas. They talk about what these things might have been used for. For example, some of these might have been used as perfume. You have a discussion on other objects that have been found in this particular site. And then what it's telling you here is why it's important. So we get a clear picture of the economy of the site. So people were, what's called a subsistence strategy, or the way that they were gathering food, is based on cultivation of cereals, or wheat and barley. And then they were also finding wild food, wild fruits, wild tubers, and they were eating those. They were also herding livestock. And the article ends by saying, you know, this is important, especially with this word, paleoethnobotanical. So paleo means old, ethno is really about people, and the botanical is plants. So what old cultures and plant evidence can tell us is that when it's a case like this, we need to first look at their funerary beliefs, and that tells us about their attitude of life. So of course, the funerary beliefs are gathered from this particular plot and this particular burial site, and the material found in the burial site. Okay, so you read the abstract, you read the introduction, read the conclusion. Now go back and reread everything again. So read the abstract, read the introduction. I'm not going to go through it again because we just went through it. You can skip the methods and materials, and then you can go to the results. Now, this particular article, I don't think the results are all that important for you to read through. You should certainly skim through, because what it does is talks about the various items that were found in the bag. So, and what I tend to do is when I don't know words, I look them up. You can put in these search engines, or it tells you right here that that particular genus and species is dill. And it tells you that they found dill. And then you've got these drupes, and it tells you what those particular are. And of course, what they talk about here is the valuable sources of oil in ancient Egypt. And then you've got the tubers, where it talks about the various tubers, and so on. So you can read through all of that. I've highlighted a bit of the last section of the results on conifer woods, where it talks about how they found a sliver of wood in her bag. It's not quite clear what it was, but it seems to be either cedar or fir, cypress, or juniper. Now, more than likely what's happening is that wood is not native to Egypt, so it was imported or brought into wood. So we're talking about the pre-dynastic period and trade. So somehow this woman got a piece of wood in her bag, so it was put in there when she was buried. It's probably coming from the Sinai Peninsula, Libya, the Levant, which is the Middle East, East Africa, or Arabia. Um, and so that's really interesting because it tells us not only about food that she's eating, but it talks about trade, or it can tell us about trade in this particular area. Then you have the discussion of what it all means. And a lot of times in a discussion, you're going to see repeats. So it's going to talk about, the pre-dynastic inhabitants had their own subsistence strategy. They cultivated cereals, gathered wild tubers and fruits, as well as animal husbandry. And then it's talking about, some of these were charred or roasted or cooked tubers. And what that means in terms of eating. A lot of tubers can't be eaten directly unless they're cooked, or they could be cooked down to get their oil. So really interesting discussion on that. One thing I haven't mentioned too is that there were cosmetic items found inside of this bag. So different types of things probably for makeup. And so they found that. And then they also found things that, I just mentioned that would be used for perfume. So what this is doing is it's sort of giving you an overview again of what the article is about. And then of course you go to the conclusion. So the article ends where once again the article is talking about food subsistence and the fact that a lot of material that we know of comes from their funerary beliefs. And because she was found with the bag in her burial site, that tells us something about religion. And then the items in there tell us about agriculture and with that piece of wood, trade. Now, one thing you should make sure you do with these articles is look at the references. So if there's anything in here that sounds interesting, you can say, for example, if you wanted to know where this material is coming from, you'd look at the bottom, Zohari, 1973. So here's Zohari, 1973. And this is a book called Flora Palestina, or the Plants of Palestine. But make sure you look through the bibliography on all of these articles, and especially if you want more information or end up using them for your podcast.